What's up, APUSH? It's early in the morning. It is 7 o'clock on Monday. I hope you guys had a wonderful weekend. If you celebrate Easter, well, then I hope you guys had a nice Easter. I myself did a lot of work working on master's stuff, but also been working on the APUSH key themes and date sheet over here, which I will have for you guys probably this afternoon or by tomorrow morning at the latest. But this video is for the APUSH review for Unit 2, or what the College Board says, Period 2, 1607 to 1754. Of course, those are some key dates. Every time that the College Board gives us a specific date range, we should try to know what those dates are. 1607, of course, is Jamestown, and then 1754 is the start of the French and Indian War. So thus, we have our colonization era right here. This is our era in which our 13 colonies are formed, as well as the West Indian companies in the Caribbean are formed. I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit. So according to the College Board, this is the unit standard. Europeans and American Indians maneuvered and fought for dominance, control, and security in North America, and distinctive colonial and native societies emerged. Okay, so what they want us to know here is that Europeans are fighting for the colonies. We also have, of course, American Indians fighting for the colonies. And also they want us to know the distinctive colonial and native societies emerged. They want us to know what the differences are between the regional colonies in their respective places, whether that be New England, whether that be the Chesapeake, whether that be the southern colonies or the middle colonies. We have to know the differences between them. And that makes up a lot of what this unit really is, and thus it's called the colonization era. This is going to get in the way a lot. That's okay. Okay. So key themes and dates for the colonization era. There's three key themes. One is the differences in goals, cultures, and the environments led Europeans to develop diverse colonies. That's what we just talked about. We also have triangle trade and mercantilism raging in this time period. We know that the Atlantic slave trade is officially banned in the United States in 1807. So we have this time period from 1607 to 1754. This is kind of the height of the Atlantic slave trade. This is when lots of slaves are moving through the Pacific, although for lots of this time period, not a lot of slaves are coming to North America. They're largely going to the Caribbean, or they are going to South America, to Brazil, etc. But we have a date when that changes. And that date is 1676 down here, which is Bacon's Rebellion, because after Bacon's Rebellion, our southern colonies start looking for less troublesome workers, and thus we start seeing more imports of slaves from West Africa. We also have the Great Awakening to end up this unit, because Great Awakening is a really nice one to remember because it is that first mass movement of American people. Of course, our colonies very divided. They aren't under a central government, but that the Great Awakening is the first purely American movement that passes through the colonies. The contextual vocabulary in this time period, guys, it's all about mercantilism. It's all about the Navigation Acts, because, of course, England is allowing the formation of these English colonies in North America because it's looking to derive wealth from them. Mercantilism, we know, is the amount of power that your country has is equal to the amount of gold and silver in its vaults. And thus England is looking to get gold and silver from these respective colonies in order to increase its power in Europe. And so these colonies, although many of them formed by private citizens, or formed by, in Jamestown's case, by a joint stock company, England looks to derive wealth from these by, of course, enacting mercantilist laws such as the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts are a really big one and will definitely be important in contextualization, guys. If you got a question from Unit 3, or upcoming unit, which is on the Revolutionary period. All commerce must travel on English or colonial ships, which of course colonial ships are English at this stage. All goods must pass through English ports first. So if you wanted to trade, first to France, you had to go through England first, and then England could enact a tax from that, and possibly retrade it to France. All enumerated goods need to go to England only, and that would be things like tobacco, especially, but also certain lumber that needed to go to England to build the English ships. And C, colonists not allowed to manufacture any products that would compete with English industries, um, especially textiles. Of course, England so heavily dependent upon the textile industry. Of course, the Navigation Act's very resented by our American colonies, but they weren't resented a tremendous amount in this time period because, of course, England really didn't have the power to enforce them. And largely because of things going on in England, like the 30 Years' War, like the English Civil War, all of these things. And once all of that strife in England is finally resolved, that's where England starts to take a much more heavy-handed approach to the American colonies. Okay, so our first key concept: difference in imperial goals, cultures, and the North American environments that different empires confronted led Europeans to develop diverse patterns of colonization. So we need to know the goals of the peoples that arrived, their culture, and the environment, and how that influenced the colonies. Of course, the 13 colonies of the British Empire, regional and sectional differences based a lot on topography, climate, and natural resources available, and the background of the settlers. We have 4 different regions that we need to know about: the New England colonies up at the top, the Middle colonies, the Chesapeake colonies, and the Lower South colonies. Notice this is called the Lower South colonies because sometimes the Chesapeake is grouped into the South. When you look at the Civil War, for instance, Virginia, of course, secedes. Maryland, however, does not, although they probably wanted to secede and just, Abraham Lincoln didn't let them. Okay, let's start with the Chesapeake. So Jamestown, of course, founded in 1607, and it is not a great place to pick to have a colony because it is a swampy, malarial-ridden area, and it is a place in which is not going to be able to grow lots of foodstuffs. In fact, starvation is a huge problem initially when it comes to trying to survive in this new world. Um, we see that in the beginning, our colonists coming to Jamestown really came in search of gold, and in fact, we know that they weren't there to stay for several reasons. One, they're formed by a joint stock company, the Virginia Company, who is sending adventurers to come in and find fabulous wealth like gold, and then return back to England to give back, profits on these investors. Um, of course, the problem is that when they send over about 100 people to arrive in modern day Virginia, they send only men. Only men have been sent on the first ship over, and this shows right away the intentions of the Virginia Company. The intentions is not to establish the first English continuous settlement that becomes a mighty United States nation. Instead, it's there for a quick stop to look for gold and then return back to England. Um, but right away, this way of thinking is going to get the Virginia Company in trouble because we have these 100 men that are looking around for gold. They can't find gold. And then they realize, uh-oh, this isn't going to be as easy as the Spanish are making it seem. And so now they have to have a lasting settlement of some kind, but they don't have experience with manual labor. They don't have experience, especially with farming. And it isn't until people start starving to death that John Rolfe is going to kind of help save the day. And really, we can't even give credit to John Rolfe because it's really the local Powhatan Indians that saved the day over in Jamestown because they look at these initial settlers certainly not as a threat and perhaps as an ally against their own Indian adversaries. And because of this, they're going to help Jamestown in these early times to produce foodstuffs and crops that allow them to survive and perfect the methods of raising and curing tobacco. And tobacco becomes the major cash crop of the Chesapeake region. because it grows so wildly in North America, and because it can be sold back to Europe, where the demand is continuing to rise back in Europe. Um, we see that tobacco is an unusual crop because it can be grown anywhere. It doesn't have to be cultivated in these specific climates and specific, um, difficult environments, such as the southern crops like rice or indigo. Tobacco can be grown anywhere. It was grown in fields, but it was grown also in between graves and in people's backyards. It was for that reason kind of called a poor man's crop, because you could derive some wealth from it by just having that as your local family crop in your backyard. Lots of the farmers that initially came over and used tobacco as their cash crop were small families, small immigrant families. You're coming over to the new world. You're largely probably not a very successful person. You've largely come over because you couldn't find any wealth over in the old world. Maybe you're a second son. You didn't have any land or what have you. Um, but coming over to the new world meant that if you could gain some land, you could get some prosperity with tobacco. And again, lots of our early families cultivating tobacco were a husband and a wife, perhaps an indentured servant or two, and you could make a modest wealth out of that. However, that did not mean that all of our farmers in the Chesapeake were poor. In fact, some of our very successful initial colonists coming over to Virginia were, in fact, from the lordship families of the old world. For instance, the Washingtons or the Lees came in with a tremendous amount of wealth and utilized that wealth to make themselves quite profitable tobacco plantations. And this is where we see them continue to buy land to the west, to the west, to the west, having these huge horizontal tracts of land. And by doing so, they really control the politics in the Chesapeake region, because when we see our House of Burgesses created, we see that only landed people, landed white males, in fact, could vote. And because of this, the first families of Virginia, they call them, really dominated politics in the Chesapeake region. And you can see that by dominating politics, we're going to see specific laws employed that are going to benefit the rich, the benefit the people that have land. And the best example of that is the head right system. And the head right system was a system in whoever paid the passage of a laborer coming over to the New World got right to acquire 50 acres of land. So this is an interesting situation here. So obviously, indentured servants, we know what indentured servants are. These are people that can't afford their way over to the New World, and so they pledge themselves to work 5 to 7 years for a landowner in the New World if that said landowner pays for them to come over to the New World in the first place. However, by doing that, we see that with the head right system, these first families of Virginia that have the wealth to be able to pay for indentured servants, every time they do so under the head right system, acquire 50 more acres of land. This means that the rich only get richer over here in the Chesapeake, and especially in Virginia, you're going to see an aristocratic tinge to it, as so many aristocrats and first families of Virginia dominate the House of Burgesses. The social breakdown of the Chesapeake is really interesting and unfortunate if you are a man, because starting off, first of all, when we get in the beginning, 1607, again, there's only 100 people, and they're all men. In fact, by the time we get to 1609, 2 years later, you see 400 colonists in Jamestown. And it is a terrible, terrible time to be in Jamestown. In fact, the starving time winter between 1609 and 1610, we see the numbers dwindle from 400 colonists to only 60 colonists, to 340 of the 400 colonists starve to death or freeze to death in that starving time winter. And it is clearly a very, very dangerous place to live. And still viewed back in England as a place in which you were coming in to derive a little bit of wealth and then get out of there. And so, because of this, largely the people that are coming to Jamestown are workers, are indentured servants, are people that are coming in that are going to work a couple of years and then maybe look to buy their own land or look to move somewhere else. And so, in the beginning, men outnumber women by a tremendous amount. In 1650, it's 6 to 1. By the time we get to 1700, almost 100 years after the founding of Jamestown, it's still 3 to 1 as far as men to women. Um, Now, because of this, however, women have better rights in the Chesapeake colonies, in Virginia and Maryland, because the life expectancy in general is so much lower than in other places. We saw a lot of men dying and leaving their wives with everything, the property, their wealth, etc. And to encourage women to come to Jamestown and become to these new colonies, women were given rights such as being able to inherit all of these things, which is very different than either back in England or just up a little bit to the north in the Massachusetts Bay colonies where women didn't have any rights at all. We also see the reasons why people are dying: malaria, typhoid, dysentery, and Indian raids. The reason why Indian raids becomes very prevalent in the Chesapeake colonies is because of the nature of tobacco. Tobacco is very ruinous to the soil. You plant tobacco, and it's going to yield you many, many crops. But if you plant it very selfishly, continue to use that same soil for the same crop, you're going to run into soil depletion. It will no longer have any nutrients in the soil, and therefore you have to move west to be able to find some new land to grow some more tobacco. Because of this, as people are constantly moving west, away from the coast, away from Jamestown, you're going to run, of course, into Native Americans, into Indian societies. That's going to bring those Indian raids on these Jamestown settlements. Another interesting thing to point out for the Jamestown colony and the Chesapeake colonies in general, the first upper education, higher education, was the College of William and Mary in 1693. While that date sounds early to us, guys, in fact, that was very late. Jamestown's established in 1607. They don't bother to form higher education until 86 years later. What this tells us about the Chesapeake is this is a predominantly agricultural society that doesn't put a lot of emphasis in upper education. They put a lot of emphasis in land ownership and cultivation of tobacco. You contrast this with the Massachusetts Bay colonies, and you realize that this is a much different culture and lifestyle, much different values. Self-rule from the beginning. Two important proper nouns to remember when it comes to the Chesapeake colonies. The first is the charter of the Virginia company, guaranteeing colonists the rights of Englishmen. That promise of the rights of Englishmen comes back to burn England, because more and more of the colonies that are established in North America are going to give similar promises. You will enjoy all the rights of Englishmen, even though you're living in North America, because North America is just an extension of England. Well, the problem, of course, comes after 1754, after the French and Indian War, in which England starts raising taxes on these North American colonists. And the North American colonists say, this isn't fair. Over in England, they have a say in Parliament before they raise taxes. We're guaranteed the rights of Englishmen. How come we are not being consulted when it comes to new taxation? So that is an important document, the Charter of the Virginia Company. And then, of course, the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is our first colonial representative assembly, our first self-government. And it's important to point out right from the beginning, guys, our colonies have representative assemblies. When you look at the reasons for the revolution, obviously taxation without representation is very important, but also it's direct control. It's the resentment of a central authority telling our colonies what to do. I mean, when we talk about the history of the United States, there is always a theme of a resentment for a federal government, a central authority telling the states, or in this case, the colonies, how to live their lives. And that comes right from the beginning. In 1619, we're in Virginia. They set up their self-rule in which white male property owners from each county could vote. Because of the monopolistic land ownership in Virginia, this didn't mean that it was heavily democratic, although, of course, it is in some ways a democracy. Um, in 1624, the King James I is going to revoke the Virginia Company and put it under royal control. But even in doing so, the House of Burgesses still remains as the local governing body and really controls everyday life. Although, as I mentioned before, dominated by the first families of Virginia because of the monopolistic land ownership. Chesapeake Indian relations. Okay, so from the beginning, there were several Indian groups in the Chesapeake, and in the initial meeting between our colonists, John Smith, the captain of the first ship in, and the first Indian chief that they encountered, the first Indian chief was Chief Powhatan, and because of this, the name the Powhatan Indians stuck where all Indians in the area were called Powhatan Indians by the English. In fact, that's a big misnomer, but nonetheless, that has stuck till this day. So we have this Powhatan Confederacy, which are all of our Indian groups that are around the area. And at first, the English heavily need to depend upon the Powhatan Indians to help them. We talked about how they showed John Rolfe how to cultivate tobacco, but just in general, helping them survive with foodstuffs, with maize, all these things. However, once we have 1610 comes around, the Virginia Company is going to send in reinforcements. They're going to send in Lord De La Warr. And Lord De La Warr is fresh off of using Irish tactics against the Irish, really nasty wartime tactics back against the Irish. And he is going to be sent in to come in and eliminate potential economic adversaries in the New World, meaning Lord De La Warr has been sent in to get rid of the Indians, push them off their land so that there's more land available to cultivate tobacco for our English settlers. And so things really turn bad in the Chesapeake region when Lord De La Warr arrives, because he is going to raid Indian villages, burn houses, torch cornfields. I mean, really, really nasty stuff. And that's going to start two Anglo-Powhatan wars. The first one, 1610 to 1614, is going to actually end with John Rolfe being married to Pocahontas in a political move. But things break down 30 years later, and the second Anglo-Powhatan war starts. Finally, especially because of disease, the Powhatan Indians will be extinct in the Chesapeake region. Really, the first of terrible relations between the English and most Indian groups in the New World. The other colony that emerges out of the Chesapeake, of course, is Maryland. And Maryland's very unique. Maryland is our only of the 13 colonies that has at least initially, a majority of Catholics. This is because Lord Baltimore, the English prominent lord from England, who comes from a long Catholic family, is going to found Maryland as a haven for Catholics. And it is meant to be a place in which all Catholics from England can come and move and live in prosperity. We see in England they are still persecuting against Catholics because we are going through the Protestant Reformation over in England, and King Henry VIII has founded the Anglican Church, the Church of England, in protest against the Catholic Church, or in protest, really. He just wanted to get a divorce, but that's a separate lesson. And so, Maryland becomes this haven for Catholics. But the problem is that, yes, initially you can have it be a haven for Catholics, but of course the American people, or still the English people, are very footloose. They are constantly moving and they are constantly looking for available land. And because we have all these first families of Virginia in Virginia, we don't have a lot of available land in Virginia. And so many farmers look to Maryland as a place for available land. And so we see lots of poor Protestant farmers move into Maryland. Because of this, we no longer see a Catholic majority in Maryland. We start to see a Protestant majority. And so out of desperation, the Maryland Local Assembly is going to pass what we call the Act of Toleration. which is passed in 1649. And this was tolerance for all Christians, and in fact, tolerance for anyone who accepted the divinity of Jesus. And that actually sounds very, very tolerant for the era, and it was. But I say for the era because there were still groups that were persecuted under this, one of which were Jews, another of which were atheists. If you divide the divinity of Jesus, the punishment was death. And so we did see death punishment over here in Maryland for anyone that defies the divinity of Jesus. Okay, and then we talk about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony. As you can see from this map, they are right next to each other. And in fact, the Plymouth Colony is actually going to be eventually absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And these will become 4 different colonies eventually. It'll become the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Of course, when we talk about the New England colonies, the biggest thing we have to remember is the reason for settlement is religious motivation. And let's talk about a little bit of context for that. Over in England and all of Europe, we see the Protestant Reformation raging at this stage. All these new Protestant Christian religions that are emerging and protesting against the Catholic Church. Because of this, largely all of our colonists coming over for religious motivations and coming into the Massachusetts Bay Area are going to be Protestants. They are protesting against the Catholic Church. However, we also see that many of them aren't looking to separate from the Catholic Church. They're simply looking to purify, they are trying to separate from the Catholic Church, but they are looking to purify their new Anglican Church and get rid of all of the Catholic residues that still exist in the Anglican Church. For instance, they don't want to have to share a pew with any Catholics. They want to be able to worship at their Church of England without even associating with Catholics. Because of this, we see some extreme Protestants. They're going to come over and try to form a new way of life over in Massachusetts. Many of these Protestants are going to follow one of the Protestant religions that emerged in the time period, Calvinism. Calvinism becomes a very, very important religion when it comes to the foundations of America. And so let's talk about Calvinism for a second. Our New England Puritans are Calvinists, and that means that they believe in predestination. They believe that from the moment of conception, that God has already determined whether a person is going to heaven or they're going to hell, and that good deeds are not going to help you when it comes to knowing or going to hell or heaven. You don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. You have been chosen already. And so because of this, we have all of our Calvinists are in constant fear that they may be going to heaven or they may be going to hell. They don't know. And so they're constantly looking for a sign. They are looking for a sign from the heavens that they are one of the elect, one of the chosen ones that are destined for heaven. And there is supposed to be this sign from God in which you feel this really moving spiritual conversion, and you have been shown by God that you are one of the special ones, one of the elect. And then you become a visible saint, and you're supposed to live the rest of your life as a visible saint, showing the rest of the world that you are in fact one of the chosen ones. That is Calvinism. And this is going to heavily influence all aspects of life over in Massachusetts Bay. It's going to, of course, affect the government. It's going to affect the social structure, all of these things. All of these things I talked about here. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims are just a little bit different. Our Puritans want to purify the Anglican Church from within. Our Pilgrims, the initial Pilgrims coming across on the Mayflower, wanted to separate from the Anglican Church entirely. They wanted to form their own way of life. And in fact, first they went to Holland and they lived there for 12 years. And then they decided instead, no, we're going to come over to the New World. We're going to try things over here. We're going to come over and form our own type of society. And because of this, they sailed the Mayflower in 1620. 102 people aboard. Very much different than the first ship sailing to Jamestown. This has men and women. They're looking to start a way of life. They're looking to stay for good. In fact, right as they arrive, aboard the Mayflower, the Pilgrims drew up and signed a document, the Mayflower Compact. This is a step towards self-government. And right from the beginning, they promised that they are going to make decisions by the will of the majority. And when you look at New England, guys, you're going to see that New England is much more democratic when it comes to how many people can vote and how many people have a say in their government than the other places, the other regions of colonies throughout the North American colonies. Right from the beginning, they have town meetings in which decisions are made by raising your hand, by the will of the majority. And that really starts with the Mayflower Compact. The Separatists are going to merge, the Pilgrims are going to eventually merge with the Massachusetts Bay Colony to form one large Massachusetts Bay Colony. And speaking of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, very influential on the culture of New England. We see this large colony that was formed by royal charter, and the first governor is an English lawyer and very prominent lord who is coming over because he feels religiously motivated to form a perfect society, a perfect religious society. He served as governor for 19 years. And he has this quote, "We shall be a city upon a hill in which the eyes of God and the world are watching." He wants to form this perfect religious society. And to do this, we're going to see a very religious-based government. They have a church called the Congregational Church. But you could only be a member of the church if you were a visible saint. Visible saints had to have, again, those spiritual conversions where God has shown you that you are one of the elect. And only freedmen, these male members of the Puritan Church, could vote. Now, that's 2/5 of the population. So right off the bat, wow, that's 40% of the population could vote. That's actually quite democratic for the time period, far more than the House of Burgesses, which are dominated, of course, by the first families of Virginia. The church also gets to pick government officials. They can elect the governor. They can elect members for the Representative Assembly, which is called the General Court. They also believe that the purpose of government was to enforce God's laws. So you're looking at this now and you're saying this is pretty much a theocracy. This is government absolutely controlled by the church. In fact, the church is going to collect taxes, tithes. So we see that this is essentially a completely church-controlled colony. But there is an important discrepancy with this. Clergymen could not hold public office. Clergymen could not be elected to the Representative Assembly. They could not be the governor. And the thought process in this was that, yes, they did believe that the purpose of government was to enforce God's laws, but at the same time, they are breaking away from the Church of England for a reason. They are trying to purify the Church of England for a reason. The Church of England was seen by many of these Massachusetts Bay colonies because the king was the head of the Church of England and doing everything that he wanted. And so they said there needs to be a separation of church and state, even if we believe that the purpose of government is to enforce God's laws. And so they did intentionally have separation of church and state because of what was going on in England with the Church of England. As I mentioned, and I'll mention it again, town meetings, very important part of New England. All male property owners could vote. Now, let me first speak a little bit about the literacy and all these things in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unlike the Chesapeake region and the southern regions, education was highly promoted. And we can see that in a number of ways. For one, the literacy rate. The literacy rate in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was 50%. Half of the people could read. That is absolutely incredible for this time period. This is by far the highest literacy rate in the Western world at this stage. Lots of people needed to be able to read. And of course, the reason being because the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony wanted you to be able to read the Bible. You needed to be able to practice and study the religion, of course. Another way in which we can see that the education was far more promoted in Massachusetts Bay in these New England colonies were because Harvard, the first higher education, was established in 1636. They got to work right away in establishing higher education. If you look at when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established, 1629. So we're talking about 7 years later when they established Harvard, which, albeit was religiously based, it was supposed to be for training ministers for the church. But nonetheless, we see higher education formed 7 years after initial colonization, rather than 86 years when it comes to the Williams and Mary down in the Chesapeake colonies. Okay, Rhode Island, and to a lesser extent Connecticut, but especially Rhode Island, guys, becomes a place, also of course in New England, where we see religious dissenters being banished out of Rhode Island. One of our first examples is Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson gets banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for questioning the Puritan authorities. She believed in something called antinomianism, which she actually, I think, just liked to question authority. She was really, really smart and bright, and so she wanted her voice to be heard. And so she comes up with this idea, antinomianism, which was the idea that because everybody believes in Calvinism, that you were selected by God at conception to be able to either go to heaven or to go to hell. It's predestined. She believes, therefore, why does she have to act a certain way on earth? Why does she have to follow what the church is telling her? Why does she have to do any of these things if she is already predestined to go to heaven or hell? So she starts to question Puritan authorities. And when this happens, the direct, lifeline of the Massachusetts Bay Colony is threatened. So she is banished away, and she moves to the land that becomes Rhode Island. At first, living there illegally as a squatter, and then this man, Roger Williams, is going to kind of come in and help establish Rhode Island. Roger Williams, he's a Puritan minister, and he wants to break away completely from the Anglican Church. He also says that the Massachusetts Bay Colony is illegal because it didn't purchase land from Native Americans to form it. He was a big believer that Native Americans fell under the purview of Christianity and predestination as well. And so he viewed what the Massachusetts Bay Colony was doing without rewarding Native Americans for their land as corrupt. He also challenges the authorities. He is also banished. And so he is going to move and found Providence, which becomes the capital of Rhode Island. And in forming this, he is going to form a very liberal, a very, very tolerant colony that is going to have all sorts of very universal, tolerant laws. For instance, recognizing American Indian land and paying them for its use. Look at this religious toleration. Catholics, Quakers, and Jews all free to worship freely. That is very unusual for the time period anywhere around the world. And then almost universal manhood suffrage. Yes, there is a small property requirement, but very, very democratic in that sense. I will mention also, guys, that when it comes to property requirements are going to exist in every single colony, but property requirements are different based off of the types of land practices that exist. Again, I'll use New England as an example. New England, because of its soil, which I'll talk about the economy in just a second, we didn't see those large farms. We saw much smaller plots of land that are designated to each family. And because of this, there was far more people that owned land. And with that, you'd see places like Rhode Island, where if there's a small property requirement, that's a lot of people being able to vote. When it comes to a property requirement in the Chesapeake or the southern colonies, much, much different situation. Because of the monopolistic land ownership down there, we see very, very few people being able to vote, and the big landowners dominating politics. It says down there, because Rhode Island tolerated religious belief, it served as a refuge for many religious dissenters. and people really, lots of fishermen as well. Okay. The New England colonies at a glance. So let's just go over all of these things that we've covered with New England. They've got the highest literacy rate amongst any of the colonies, as we mentioned. In fact, already talking about the 50% literacy rate. The other thing with education is that when each new town formed in the New England colonies, it was stipulated by law that there must be public education in each town, which is way, way forward when it comes to public education. Public education doesn't become universal in the United States until the 19th century. So we're talking, 250, 300 years earlier. Town meetings I talked about. Okay, the economy, very, very big with New England. Much, much colder up in New England and much different types of soil. We have rocky soil that is not very tolerant of farming. In fact, farming is very difficult to conduct in New England. And even if you could farm, you're going to run into problems with those long winters where you have these very short growing seasons. And so because of this, we have to have this New England ingenuity. They need to come up with new ways and different ways to make money than the traditional farming economies. And because of this, New England, all the way from the beginning, becomes really our first center of industrialization. It also becomes our first center of merchants, of trade, because they cannot produce wealth themselves. And we're going to see an economy based off of logging, so cutting down trees, shipbuilding, which is a form of manufacturing, fishing, trading, and rum distilling. Especially rum, of course, because of the connection that New England has in the triangular trade, which we'll talk about next class. But when it comes to rum distilling, we've got that triangular trade. We've got manufactured goods coming, especially from England or Europe, down to Western Africa, trading those manufactured goods for slaves. Those slaves coming over to the Caribbean, selling those slaves, trading those slaves for sugar, and then making that way up into New England, where you would trade that sugar and get back whatever it is you're getting back, rum or ships or what have you. But that sugar used to make rum, right? Okay, so New England. Not very agricultural, much more based off a much more diverse economy, logging, shipbuilding, fishing, trading, rum distilling. And in fact, great quote from your book, which I'll remind you of, guys. Not all of our colonists that move to the New England colonies are devoutly religious or are Calvinists. In fact, many people move to New England because the fishing is so good. The quote from your book, many colonists much more interested in cod than God. Okay, the New England Confederation and the Dominion of New England. Let's go over these two things so that we don't mix them up. The New England Confederation is formed by our New England colonies themselves. They're forming them to unite against the dangers that exist in North America at this stage. The biggest dangers that exist. One, of course, Native Americans. That's one of the biggest reasons that the New England Confederation is formed, to protect a mutual alliance, a defensive alliance against Native American attacks. Also, the French. The French with Samuel de Champlain formed just a year after Jamestown. New France has been formed in Canada, and the French are constantly moving south following the Beaver, which is, of course, inevitably going to bring them into contact with English settlements. And then the Dutch as well. The Dutch in New York are there for a small period, and the New England Confederation is formed as an alliance against the Dutch, the French, and Native Americans. The biggest success of the New England Confederation is against Native Americans. There was a war called King Philip's War. Weird name, because the chief of the Native American group that they were warring against was Chief Metacom. The colonists called him King Philip for whatever reason. And so the one success, or one of the many successes, the biggest success with the New England Confederation was winning King Philip's War and pushing off American resistance, Native American resistance out of New England. Okay, the Dominion of New England. I believe this to be our last slide. It is. Okay, so It's our last slide, so I'm going to give you guys a little context and make you listen just a little bit longer before I sign off with you guys. So Charles the First. Let's start with Charles the First. I know it says Charles the Second up there, but we're gonna go Charles the First. Charles the First was a notorious king in English history because Charles the First was the guy that really wanted to participate in the 30 Years' War in the name of Protestantism, and so he started to raise taxes in England without the consent of Parliament. When he did this, this sets a series of steps in motion that would result in the English Civil War, where we see two sides taking place. The royalists, who are going to side with Charles I, and the parliamentarians, they're going to side with Parliament. Literally, England goes to war over raising taxes without the consent of Parliament, and they fighting this war for a long time. The Parliament's led by Oliver Cromwell, who is this Puritan that is out for the king's head. And sure enough, the parliamentarians are successful in this war. And when this happens, Charles I loses his head, and it looks like we might have a pure democracy over there in England until, nope, Oliver Cromwell seizes power and rules England by himself. And he has these 10 years of this complete dictatorship when finally he dies and his son, Richard Cromwell, comes to power. And finally, the people in England have had enough. And they say, nope, we need to bring back a monarch, someone with royal blood. And so they go in and they bring in Charles II, the son of the deceased Charles I, to come in and rule England. Now, why I bring you all this context is because England was going through a tremendous amount of political turmoil at home. And this is the biggest reason in why the Navigation Acts were so loosely enforced. They just didn't have the resources to be going in and policing trade over in North America when you have all of these political conflicts back home. But once we see Charles I now sitting on the throne, unquestioned once again, we now see that the crown can take more of an interest in their North American colonies. They start issuing orders to follow the Navigation Acts or else. And yet, because we've had this long period of salutary neglect, these royal orders are going to be met with relative indifference, especially in the places where the Navigation Acts are most important, like, for instance, Massachusetts Bay, New England. Over in New England, these are the people really affected by the Navigation Acts because these are the merchants, these are the traders. And so because of this, we see that New England is going to be targeted by our English monarchs for not following the rules. Charles II, James II, they're going to revoke Massachusetts Bay's charter for not following the royal orders. And then, in order to keep them under control of London, they are going to form the Dominion of New England. Unlike the New England Confederation, this was formed by the royalty to control New England. And that includes New England, New York, and New Jersey, both New York and New Jersey, technically middle colonies. The purpose was to make them follow the navigation laws. And to do this, they're going to send in the totalitarian Sir Edmund Andros. Sir Edmund Andros is there to come in and kind of stamp out democracy and make everybody follow royal law. He's going to stop town meetings. He's going to dispense with the popular assemblies, meaning you can't make decisions anymore. I make all the decisions. And he's going to tax people without the consent of their elected representatives. Wow, we might have a revolution here in the 1680s. Because here's Sir Edmund Andros taking control. He's enforcing the Navigation Acts. He's suppressing smuggling. And smuggling had been a very glorified profession up until this point, and it will continue to be a glorified profession. But then in England, we have the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution is when the people of England, and especially Parliament, looks to James II, the English monarch, as an unacceptable ruler because he is Catholic and he needs to be pushed out. And so Parliament invites his own daughter, Mary, and her husband in the Netherlands, William of Orange, to come in and overthrow James II in the name of Protestantism. And when this happens, we see that James is pushed out of England, and that now we have these two new rulers in England, who once again usher in another period of salutary neglect, that aren't as interested in the North American colonies. Why would I go into all of this detail about English politics, guys? To prove a point. The point is, at this stage, guys, that even though we now see a new period of salutary neglect, there are residues that are left by Sir Edmund Andros and by Charles II and James II in the North American colonies. We see more crown appointed judges than ever. We see more appointed crown appointed governors than ever still in North America. These residues exist. And so how our New England colonists, how all of our American colonists control these governors and judges is by controlling their purse. They are still paid by the local assemblies, by the House of Burgesses, by the General Court. And as long as they can control these governors and judges, their way of life will not be threatened. One of the biggest reasons why the Intolerable Acts, when we come into the 1770s, why they were so intolerable was because they shifted this arrangement and they made it so that the governors and they made it so that the judges from England were paid not by the local assemblies but by the crown themselves. That is going to be quite intolerable for our by our colonists. Okay, guys, lots of talking from Mr. Hill today. We are ending our lecture today with an SAQ. This SAQ will be turned in on Schoology as it always is with your partner. Again, a reminder, please do this on a Word document. If neither you nor your partner has Word, you only have Pages, for instance, one thing that you can do is do it on Pages, take a picture of it, and then submit it to Schoology that way. For some reason, it accepts Word documents, it accepts PDFs. It doesn't do great with Pages. It doesn't do great with Google Docs. So keep that in mind. All right, guys, this is your assignment for the day. I will post this PowerPoint right now so you guys have access to it. Hope you guys had a great weekend, and I look forward to talking to you guys at our next Zoom meeting. Bye, guys.